2022 is a year that exists in an era of political tension. The partisan division has challenged the very nature of what America stands for, which presents unique challenges for Generation Z, one of the most politically involved young generations in the history of the United States. How do they create a respectful dialogue? How should they feel about hot-button issues? And most importantly, how can they get involved in the political process beyond casting their ballot? Today, we will address these questions and have a discourse with our panel of students. My name is Courtney Bondar, and welcome to Wisconsin's Future. Our panel of guests were selected for their involvement in campus politics, their passion for the political process, and their investment in the future of the state of Wisconsin. I am very honored to introduce them to you and to moderate this event. To the left is Yusli Flores, a racial equity and economic justice advocate who is involved in the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. To the right is Miranda Spence, a former Young Americans for Freedom Marquette chairwoman and the current executive director of the Eagle Free Press. Ms. Flores, could you care to give an opening statement?
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I know my title is a mouthful, but I really also don't have a 10-second elevator speech to talk about what the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign does. But we are a political watchdog group that tracks money in politics, and we make sure that we keep a clean database with that information.
Great. Ms. Spence, would you care to give an opening statement as well?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. So at my time at Marquette, I have been involved in Young Americans for Freedom and with the Eagle Free Press, which is an independent newspaper on campus. And the point in those experiences has been to bring conservative viewpoints to campus, but also to open discussion and to open a dialogue for students, regardless of political opinions, to just discuss our opinions.
Thank you. The 2020 presidential election sparked discussion and open scrutiny into the way the voting process works in the United States. But this issue has been discussed in Wisconsin for more than a decade.
My opinion on voter identification laws are that they're necessary, but I do think they exclude a major population in America, which would be like immigrants specifically. I don't feel like they get a say on politics and representation like in this country, and I think that's harmful to an extent because they are here, whether they were born here or not. I do think it's important to include them in that, and not that they're not, but I think the process of that is just made more difficult for immigrants. So yeah, I think they're necessary, of course, but I do think historically they haven't always been the greatest.
My opinion on voter identification is that it's important to include all people in the United States to have an opportunity to vote, and not everyone has the ability to get a driver's license or identification card, which makes it harder for it to be an equal vote. Although I do not know what exactly we could do in order to make sure that everyone is voting fairly without having the voter identification, driver's license.
Yeah, so my opinion on voter identification laws, I think everyone should at least show ID when they vote. Want to make sure that everyone's voting once, there's not multiple votes being submitted. Just want to keep it, as fair as possible for everyone involved.
My opinion on it is I feel like if it really helps the people, you should implement it or whatnot, but if it's not a big deal to most people, I think just leave it as it is. You don't want to invade everyone's privacy and everything.
So my opinion on voter identification would probably be that legal citizens, as well as citizens who work for the U.S. should have the right to vote for the U.S.
And now the floor is open for discussion. Ms. Flores, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I think voter ID laws impact communities of color the most. It's extremely necessary to understand how the DMV influences the election process. So in 2021, 3 organizations in the state, all voting as local, the League of Women Voters and the Wisconsin Disability Rights Coalition created a report called Getting There is Half the Battle. And that report highlighted harsh inequities in how Wisconsin officials offer the DMV services. And it just examined discriminatory barriers to DMV access. And some of the solutions was just to make the DMV more accessible to people that spoke a different language, especially people that had just become citizens, whether they were waiting 30 years or 40 years, who were, in their 60s now, that wanted to express their right to vote, just allowing them that cancellation of that language barrier. And they could easily collaborate with voter registration groups more, I guess, equitably. Just like we're asked if we want to become organ donors, right at the DMV, we could easily be asked, do you want to register to vote here and now? And yeah, they do get a free voter ID, but there can be so much more done. It's just a checkbox saying, do you want to register to vote today? Do you want an absentee ballot? There's things that we can do that can make anybody kind of feel included in our society and in the voting and election process.
Of course.
I agree with that, actually. I think what's interesting about this discussion is that it seems to be a dichotomy between do we have voter ID laws or don't we have voter ID laws? And that doesn't seem to be the debate here, which I think is interesting. Yeah, so I agree. Like when I look at data about how voter ID laws may impact communities of color, it doesn't seem to be necessarily because it's an ID, but because of access to DMVs or confusion on registration and that sort of thing. So I think that's actually a very bipartisan issue and some good common ground as far as that goes.
Yeah, I would say there's also a couple of anti-voter bills that were introduced in 2021, unfortunately by Republican legislators, right? I was able to see it directly during the April 2020 election. Myself and two other good friends went to every single pharmacy, picked up as much PPE as we could and as many pens as we could, and we drove around all 4 polling sites. During a pandemic, 4 polling sites are available to people, and we got to see these lines. And there was a high school that was a polling site, ran out of pens, and we had to run over there. So I think it's beyond access to voter ID. It's also access to just the freedom to vote. And they really limit folks by including, this voter ID issue.
Anything else you want to add to that, Miranda? No. Usely, could you go a little bit further with voter ID and what kind of benefits and drawbacks do we see from voter ID today, and how could that influence for the future to come?
I think some of the drawbacks that we kind of see is that we kind of uninvite immigrants, and we uninvite people that might not qualify for a state ID because of laws that were enacted way beyond Act 10. So we did have driver's licenses for undocumented people, which is also a safety issue. We did have in-state tuition for undocumented students. We had all of these processes that could support the next generation of America. Every 30 seconds, a Latino in the U.S. turns 18. So we are dismantling this kind of cultural freedom to participate in politics by creating all of these anti-voter ID laws. I really strongly believe that if you are undocumented and you're paying your taxes, you have an ITIN number, you have some sort of social security number, you should be allowed to access at least local politics, because those are the ones that influence communities most.
Of course. Now, do you feel there's pressure on that subject?
I definitely think so. We can see New York as an example. The city of New York is going to allow about 800,000 people to participate in local elections who are undocumented or who have at least resided in New York for at least 30 days. And I just think that's a push forward in kind of teaching people that, you're granting voting access to dreamers, to students, to workers, to people that, make America run. America doesn't run on coffee, it runs on immigrants.
Miranda, do you want to add to that at all?
Sure. I think that's a difficult discussion to have, because that almost starts a discussion on immigration itself, which is a whole other can of worms to open. But I mean, voting is a right and a privilege for American citizens, and I understand, the contributions that undocumented students and workers have in our country, and I just think that, I want to encourage people becoming citizens to have that type of access, and I feel like that's something that should be reserved for American citizens, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be included ever, or that they don't belong in political processes or anything like that.
And I don't disagree. You know, I don't disagree. I definitely think that nationally, people that are citizens should be able to decide who their president is. But like I said, I strongly believe that anybody with access to a state-issued ID should be allowed to vote, you know, at least in local elections, which again, to me, it's what matters most. It influences our children's education, it influences community-centered programs, it influences park and recreation centers, and just more locally centered political issues that influence these undocumented people's children. And these children are citizens. So if their parents don't get the right to vote, like I said, every 30 seconds a Latino in the US turns 18, so they will get to vote eventually.
Of course. Thank you guys for your comments on that, and really bringing light to this whole situation as well with voter ID. So thank you both. The Second Amendment and its role in our country has been at the center of debate since 1934, when the Congress passed the National Firearms Act. Here in Wisconsin, gun control and gun rights are a topic of constant scrutiny and debate.
You know, I think that, you know, people have the right to own guns. You know, I feel like there should be background checks in place. You know, people, you know, should make sure that, you know, whoever's trying to buy a gun, you know, is going to be responsible enough to own a gun. You know, if there's no reason for them to have a gun, you know, if they have a prior criminal history or something, then, you know, I feel like they probably should own one, just depending, you know, on what happened or what kind of crime they committed.
Unfortunately, I don't have a strong opinion on this, but I do believe that people should have legal documentation of their guns, and everyone should be screened with a background check to get one.
I think it's extremely important that we have policies of gun regulation. I think there has been many incidents just this year already of gun violence that is unnecessary, that causes fear in many people around the world, and I think that we have to do a better job of eliminating those chances of violence to happen.
That's a tough one. I think like most of the hunting rifles, they should be allowed and everything, but there comes in the question of the semi-automatic and everything, but it all just depends on the background checks. You know, if you get the right background checks and you know that these people aren't going to do bad things, you know, nothing bad's going to happen. But if it comes to an issue where people just take advantage of the system, then something needs to be done.
I think gun regulation is definitely needed, especially as a citizen of Milwaukee. And even going to Marquette University, there's been so many crimes that happen, both reported and unreported, that happen with guns and people, even if they have like licenses to carry. There needs to be sort of a crackdown on that, because a lot of people who do have guns are not using them for the right reasons, I guess you can say. So yeah, I do definitely think there needs to be, we need to look at that, and we need to not only like crack down on it, but reimagine safety in general, because I feel like safety in America is it's not good at the moment. So I think we need to just reimagine safety, and that starts especially with gun regulation, especially in Milwaukee. So.
Once again, we turn to our panelists for an open floor discussion. Ms. Spint, do you have a statement to make on this issue?
Yes, I think a good place to start with this issue is to come to the agreement that it's gun violence that's the issue and not necessarily gun control. I mean, obviously that's something to talk about, but it's a tactic to achieve the end goal, which is reducing gun violence. So I think that's a good place to start when we're talking about gun control and those types of measures. I also think it's important to kind of put gun control in context and the type of violence we have. So, for example, in 2019, 417 people died in mass shootings, a little over 10,000 were homicide victims, and over 23,000 were suicide victims. And another thing that's really interesting is that the CDC reports that guns are used defensively anywhere between 60,000 times to 2.5 million times in a year. So even on the smaller end of how many times it's used defensively, that's more people get using it defensively than are actually becoming victims of gun control or gun violence. So I think that there's just some interesting things to kind of put it into perspective. And I also think as far as laws go, it's one of those things that some work and some don't work. The ones that I have seen that seem to work more are ones that prevent certain people from having guns, so like the background checks and those kinds of things, versus banning certain types of guns that are on the streets that are available. Those types of gun control laws seem to work more, and that sort of thing. And there's so many other things that is not gun control that can be used that's much more agreed upon on both sides to decrease gun violence initially.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a point where we can possibly see eye to eye. I want to say that this opinion is solely my own and maybe not those that identify in the same political identity that I do, but I clearly support the right to bear arms. But I'm also really fully aware that this country and this right sometimes only protects white passing and white people. I guess, we can see it because Trayvon Martin, right? He was a young 12-year-old black boy holding up a toy gun and was shot to death. And I almost wonder what the difference would have been if it would have been a young white boy who was. And again, I'm not anti-gun, I'm anti the National Rifle Association, who gave more than $12 million to political campaigns. Like, there is no way that much money should be involved in politics, and let alone organizations that also support the right to bear arms in this country.
I think the point on lobbying is really interesting. I mean, I don't love lobbyists either. Definitely the money in politics is difficult. So, for example, I mentioned the types of gun control laws that seem to have a decent impact. For example, the universal background checks are associated with a 15% decrease in gun violence. I would have to do more research on a universal background check law and what that would look like, because there are Second Amendment concerns. But if it works and if there's a way that would work with Second Amendment values and that kind of thing, then I'd support it. And if I were to run for office on that opinion, I probably wouldn't get NRA funding. So there's things like that. So I agree that maybe that's not the best thing, but.
Yeah, I guess I'll add that even in radical civil rights movement history, we can look at the Black Panther Party and the Brown Berets as an example of communities that were organizing people of color, and why the FBI kind of used COINTELPRO to just get rid of these organizations, because to become a beret, to become a Panther, you needed to just read up on law, read up on your state issued laws, especially around gun control, before you could even hold a weapon. And I feel like they create a sane example for how other people should want to own a gun, should apply to want to own a gun. Know the law in your state, know what you can and can't carry, because at one point, when you choose to alter any arm, you're breaking the law, and some people just openly do that. And I always joke that if we get to another pandemic, and this time it's zombies, white people will always kill black and brown people first, and we might not even get to shoot any zombies, because it won't be a zombie versus us issue. It'll be a race issue before it becomes a zombie issue.
Interesting.
In layman's terms.
So what kind of things do you want to see to change with the NRA going forward, if there would be any changes for the future?
I mean, them, but any interest group, an example that just taking money out of politics would also really open the playing field for people of color to run for office. A lot of the times people of color lose because they just don't have the funding. They can't just call, an uncle or an aunt and ask for $10,000 for this campaign. They can't call a friend. They can't phone in any favors. I always say we are trust fund babies without the funds and little trust.
I think that's interesting, and just kind of bringing it back to solving gun violence, that kind of thing. I've learned some kind of interesting non-gun control ways to affect that, which I thought were different, that I hadn't heard of before. So for example, when you go into an emergency room, the nurses and doctors might ask you questions to see if you maybe are a victim of domestic violence in some way, to offer you resources if that's something that you want, and maybe asking questions about have you heard gunshots in your neighborhood recently, or is there a firearm in your home, just to give people a chance to ask for help before it becomes a problem. Education is a really huge one. I mean, my father's an NRA instructor. I mean, every time we go shooting, I know exactly what all the rules are. I know how to be safe, and I think that's something that needs to be much more of a focus. I think there's a bit, not a overwhelming culture, but a slight culture of people wanting to buy a gun because it looks cool and shooting in their backyard, which I don't think is the best. Even police reform. I found some really interesting articles by the Marshall Project where they did a study on the Memphis Police Department, and they could be reducing gun violence by better focusing on where they have patrols and what times in certain areas. Apparently it's a huge problem in Memphis for people to be calling the police department to handle like crazy dogs who are trying to bite people and that kind of thing, where those can be outsourced to other community organizations and programs and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do to address gun violence necessarily that I think most people would agree on to some extent. So.
Yeah.
Of course, and gun violence is a huge issue that we are facing here in our country today, and it's important to understand education, drawbacks, pros and cons, along with that to ensure that people are educated as well as in the know of what's going on currently. Generation Z is one of the most politically involved generations in the history of the nation, and it's not difficult to see why. As a generation, we have witnessed 2 wars, multiple recessions, and a pandemic, and historical presidents elected into office. But many people struggle to find ways to become involved in the political process beyond voting. This final floor discussion will be focused on how people in college can get involved in politics. Ms. Flores, how did you get involved in politics, and how can young viewers make a difference?
Yeah, so when I was undocumented in high school, I knew that I wanted to go to college. I knew that I was going to find a way to do it, and I was going to find an organization that was doing it, and there weren't any. There were organizations that were doing work for undocumented people, like Voces de la Frontera. There were organizations that were helping youth. There was a youth arm of Voces de la Frontera, Youth Empowered in the Struggle. And so I kind of confided in them and was honest about my status, and so we created the Wisconsin Tuition Equity Committee, which basically showed, and we were able to lobby, right? We were able to lobby legislative officials. I was 16 at the Capitol just talking to people because we had lost the opportunity for in-state tuition through Act 10 12 years ago. And so, you know, I found my niche. I found something that I really was passionate about because I'd never wanted anybody else to go through what I went through, being called an alien by my guidance counselor because he just didn't know that I couldn't apply, you know, for FAFSA, and then just made me apply. And this belittling feeling of like not being able to apply for FAFSA, not qualifying for grants, for Pell Grants, for loans, you know, there were all these limitations against us. And I think like if you can find something that you're really, really good at, that you enjoy, if you enjoy nature, like there's a group there advocating for climate change. You know, all of us suffer from nature deficit disorder because we don't get enough of it, especially young people. So I think we should advocate to be outside more. And again, it sounds easy that, you know, you could just get involved, but this country has this weird thing that like culturally I didn't grow up in, which is like an individualist culture. And if you find your people and you find people that really care, you can really just start there. If you like video games, there are people that are making video games that are more accessible to kids with disabilities who can't hold a controller. You know, there are organizations doing really good work to advance this country in a more democratic way.
Of course, Miranda, do you want to add anything on top of that?
Sure. I think obviously getting involved in organizations that speak to you is very important. I mean, I got involved right away my freshman year in Young Americans for Freedom, which is an amazing youth conservative activist organization for college and high school students. They're trying to get into middle school too. I think it's just things like that that kind of help you find your voice and your community and get some confidence in sharing your views and understanding them better, but also understanding other views and giving yourself those opportunities. But I also think that not everybody's as politically involved or even wants to be the way we might be. It's just things as simple as just reading the news, finding apps that show you everything for the day from every single type of source and just trying to get an idea of what's going on and just trying to stay up to date, or even just speaking up in classes and just having those conversations every day with your friends. I think that, I mean, for some people that's enough, and I think that that's what we need more of anyway, is those everyday conversations and just encouraging more people to, even if it's not your career or your most important passion, it's still something that you can be involved in even on a micro scale.
Of course. And is there any way for young viewers to get involved? Like, should we create more organizations? Should we get more education involved? How should we create more of that awareness for more young people to get politically involved as well?
Yeah, There are a few organizations in high school. So there's Youth Empowered in the Struggle, which is an acronym for YES. There's also Leaders Igniting Transformation, which is an acronym for LIT, or the acronym is LIT. There's also the Alliance for Climate Education. All of these have chapters in all over Wisconsin, and they all are involved in some way, shape, or form through just the political context and climate in Wisconsin.
Very nice, and thank you guys for your views on how young viewers can get involved and sharing yours as well. Thank you very much to these panelists being here today and hosting this event. This concludes our show. We sincerely hope that you found it worthwhile and informative. And while the political climate in our country and state may be high with generation of informed and passionate young voters, it's clear that the future has never looked brighter. If this generation continues to have productive discussions and work to find pragmatic solutions to the very problems that face Wisconsin, we can continue to move forward in prosperity as a state, country, and people. God bless Wisconsin and have a great night.